The film opens in an art gallery in Los Angeles, where Susan hosts a high-profile exhibition. That night, she drives home alone to her massive, empty mansion overlooking the glowing city below. The following morning, Susan's head of security brings her a package that was delivered to the house. It is from her ex-husband, Edward. Inside is a manuscript of his novel, along with a note explaining that she inspired the book and that he will be in Los Angeles for the week and would like to meet. The manuscript is titled Nocturnal Animals. Susan's husband enters the kitchen shortly afterward. Susan tells him she was disappointed that he did not attend her gallery opening. He says he had work and that the gallery was far away. Susan responds that it would have taken only 15 minutes and that his presence would have mattered to her. Their conversation turns to the manuscript. When her husband learns it's from Edward, he comments that Susan hasn't spoken to him in almost 20 years. Susan then suggests they spend the weekend at their beach house. Her husband explains that he needs to travel to New York to finalize a business deal and is concerned about their finances. He says he doesn't want to sell any more of their art. Susan tells him she will just fill their walls with new LA artists. So when people come over, they'll think they're ahead of the curve and not financially broke and spare him the humiliation. That night, Susan and her husband host a party at their home. During the evening, Susan speaks privately with a friend who asks how things are going. Susan says that her husband is having difficulties with his business and adds that he hates to lose. The friend asks whether Susan has been sleeping, saying she is worried about her. Susan insists that she is fine, but the friend tells her that she is very hard on herself. Susan then asks how the friend manages her own marriage. The friend explains that having a gay husband works for her. She says they are best friends, they love each other completely, and that she is the only woman in his life. She adds that this kind of stability is rare. Susan says that she and her husband don't have that kind of relationship and leaves the conversation to say goodbye to him. She tells him she hopes the deal works out and clarifies that he needs it, not her. Susan then returns to the party and speaks with the friend's husband. He tells her that her gallery opening was impressive and that she is a major success. Susan disagrees, saying that the art no longer feels meaningful to her and has become junk. The friend's husband tells her to accept the absurdity of their world and notes that it is far less painful than the real one. That night, Susan begins reading the manuscript, which is dedicated to her. The novel follows a man named Tony, who is preparing for a road trip across Texas with his wife and their teenage daughter. Tony drives late at night, planning to make the long trip without stopping. Inside the car, his daughter complains that there is no phone signal in that area, which Tony confirms. For most of the drive, the highway is empty. Eventually, Tony comes up behind two cars driving side by side at the same slow speed, blocking both lanes. Unable to pass, Tony honks. One of the cars finally moves over, but then begins swerving toward Tony's vehicle. His daughter reacts by flipping off the driver. Tony passes the car and briefly sees three men inside, all staring at his family. Moments later, the same car begins aggressively tailgating and swerving toward them. Tony tries to avoid it, but the vehicles collide. The men shout at Tony to pull over. Feeling unsafe, Tony continues driving, but the car chases him and repeatedly rams into his vehicle, eventually forcing him off the road. Tony is now stuck and has no choice but to interact with the men. One of them approaches and questions why Tony did not stop after the accident. Tony and his family say that the other car caused the collision, but the man ignores this and insists that accidents must be reported. Tony suggests calling the police. The man agrees in principle, but points out that there is no phone signal, which is true. Tony then says they will drive to a town to call for help. The man claims Tony cannot drive because he has a flat tire. Tony doubts this, so the man tells him to try driving away if he believes he is lying. When Tony does, the flat tire is confirmed. The man offers to change the tire and asks Tony to open the trunk. Tony is hesitant, but eventually steps out to access the spare tire, removing the luggage. The man then insists that Tony's wife and daughter get out of the car, so it can be safely lifted on a jack. At this point, a police car drives past. Tony and his family attempt to signal it, but it does not stop. The man laughs and remarks that the police are gone. While the tire is being changed, the other men begin harassing Tony's wife and daughter. Tony repeatedly tries to intervene, but is blocked. Throughout the encounter, Tony remains calm and non-confrontational, attempting to de-escalate the situation. Once the tire is changed, Tony tells his wife and daughter to get back into the car. The man then asks how they plan to reach a town to report the accident. Tony says both cars will drive there separately. The man rejects this idea, claiming Tony might flee, and instead insists that Tony's wife and daughter ride with him. Tony and his family refuse. As Tony moves toward his car, two of the men suddenly get inside it and drive off with his wife and daughter still inside. Tony is left behind, watching his car disappear down the road. One of the men remains with Tony and forces him to drive the other car. Tony hopes this is part of a plan to reunite him with his family. They drive through the empty highway and into a deserted area. Tony is directed onto a dirt road, where he sees his own car parked and empty. The man then orders Tony out of the car and leaves him alone in a remote clearing at night. A short time later, the men return in Tony's car. Tony hides behind a large rock and overhears them arguing about letting him escape. One of them calls out, claiming that Tony's wife and daughter want him. Tony does not respond and stays hidden until they drive away again. Tony then runs through nearby fields searching for help. He crawls under a barbed wire fence, walks along the highway, unsuccessfully trying to flag down passing cars, and eventually reaches a farmhouse where he asks to use the phone. Susan is shaken by the story and sets the manuscript aside, clearly absorbed by it. She then calls her husband in New York. He answers while walking with another woman, who remains silent during the call. They enter an elevator, and when asked for the floor, he says the 31st. Susan notes that this is not their usual room. He explains that their regular room was unavailable. When the elevator arrives, the attendant addresses the woman as Madam. Susan hears this and realizes her husband is not alone. Susan struggles to sleep and continues reading the manuscript. In the novel, Tony is taken to a police station where he speaks with a lieutenant. The officer tells him to stay at a nearby motel and wait for updates. Tony does so and breaks down alone in the room. The next morning, the lieutenant calls and informs Tony that his car has been found abandoned by the roadside, empty. Tony is told that another officer will take over the case and pick him up from the motel. Tony meets the new Lieutenant Bobby, who asks whether Tony can retrace his steps from the house where he found help. Bobby also asks if the men had guns, and Tony says they did not. They return to the house and then drive along the highway Tony had walked. Tony recognizes the barbed wire fence he crawled through, and they follow the trail from there to a remote clearing near an abandoned shack. The officer explains that no one has lived there for years. In the clearing, Tony sees the naked bodies of his wife and daughter lying on a red couch. He approaches, hoping they are asleep, but it becomes clear that both are dead. Susan stops reading, disturbed by what she has just read. She calls her daughter, who is away at college. The daughter answers sleepily and points out that it is very early. Susan apologizes for waking her up and says she just wanted to check in. Susan then has a flashback to when she reconnected with Edward in New York. They had known each other as teenagers in Texas. Edward is in the city for an interview connected to a scholarship at Columbia. Susan explains that she has already graduated from Yale and is now in New York for graduate school. When Edward says he doesn't know anyone in the city, Susan invites him to dinner. During dinner, Edward tells Susan that he spent time with her brother when they were younger because he had a crush on her. Susan tells him that her brother had a crush on Edward. Edward is surprised and feels guilty that he has not stayed in touch with him. Susan points out that Edward's reaction is thoughtful. Susan contrasts this with her own family, explaining that they rejected her brother after he came out. She describes her family as narrow-minded and says she feels disconnected from them, particularly from her mother. Edward observes that Susan and her mother share the same sadness in their eyes. Susan rejects the comparison and says she does not want to be like her mother. Their conversation turns to Susan's career. Edward asks why she gave up pursuing art, and Susan says she was not talented enough and prefers to be realistic rather than believe in an unattainable success. Edward disagrees, praising her work and telling her she undervalues herself. Susan admits that Edward was her first crush too and asks him to come home with her. Back in the manuscript, Tony is called to the police station to speak with Bobby. He tells him that his wife was killed with a hammer. He explains that it happened quickly and that she did not suffer for long. Tony is then told that his daughter was suffocated to death. Bobby adds that both of them were assaulted. Tony is left devastated by the news. Back in the present, Susan has a flashback to a lunch with her mother. During the conversation, her mother expresses concern about Susan marrying Edward. She says it is not that she dislikes him, but that she considers him weak. She tells Susan that Edward's romantic nature may seem appealing now, but that it also reflects a lack of ambition and drive. According to her mother, Edward will never amount to anything, and Susan will eventually regret tying her life to him. In the present, Susan sends an email to Edward. She tells him she is reading his novel and finds it both devastating and brilliant. She suggests that they meet. The story then returns to the manuscript. Tony is shown a photograph of the man believed to be the primary suspect, based on fingerprints found in Tony's car and near the shack. Tony studies the photo, but does not appear to recognize the man. Susan continues reading the manuscript. About a year has passed in the story, and Tony is shown depressed and burdened by guilt over what happened to his family. Bobby contacts Tony and tells him that two of the men involved have been identified through fingerprints. One of them was shot and killed, and the other is now in custody. Tony is asked to come to the police station to identify him. At the station, Tony looks through a lineup and immediately identifies Lou as the man who rode with him the night of the attack. Lou is taken away and charged. Bobby explains that the remaining suspect, Ray Marcus, is now their primary target. Back in the present, Susan's assistant expresses concern that Susan has not slept again. Susan says she never sleeps and explains that her ex used to call her Nocturnal Animal. She notes that he named his book after that and dedicated it to her. Susan adds that she loved Edward deeply, but she did not believe in him. She admits that she panicked and did something terrible to him, something she considers unforgivable. In the manuscript, Tony and Bobby travel to a remote shack where Ray is living. Ray is identified as the same man who led the group on the night of the attack. Bobby and Tony take him into custody on suspicion of abducting and murdering Tony's wife and daughter. Tony drives with Ray and Bobby in the car, watching Ray through the rearview mirror. Ray says he has never seen Tony before, and Bobby responds that this is likely because Tony shaved his beard. They drive to the isolated shack where Tony's wife and daughter were assaulted. There, Tony confronts Ray and demands to know what his wife and daughter experienced in their final moments. Ray responds by taunting Tony and deliberately provoking him. Another flashback shows Susan and Edward during their marriage. Edward asks Susan to read a novel he is working on. Susan is critical of the draft, saying it is not very strong and that the story feels too close to his own life. She adds that it lacks excitement. Edward becomes defensive, but Susan insists she is only being honest. Susan also tells him that it is unrealistic to expect to work in a bookstore while trying to write novels. Edward reacts by saying that Susan is starting to sound like her mother. The following day in class, Susan picks up a pencil dropped by another student, who we know will later become her husband. Soon after, Susan asks Edward for a divorce. Edward pleads with her to stay and asks her to be faithful, saying that when you love someone, you work through difficulties instead of leaving at the first opportunity. Despite this, Susan remains firm in her decision. Back in the manuscript, Bobby visits Tony to inform him that Ray has been released. Bobby explains that there was only circumstantial evidence against him. Tony is devastated, insisting that Ray is responsible for his wife and daughter's deaths. Bobby then reveals to Tony that he is dying of lung cancer. With nothing left to lose, Bobby says he does not want his final case to remain unresolved and is willing to act outside the law. They later find Ray at a diner and arrest him. Instead of taking Ray to the police station, they bring him to a remote shack. Lou is also brought there. The two men argue, effectively confirming their involvement. Bobby feels really sick and goes to the bathroom to vomit and hands Tony a gun, instructing him to keep the men from moving. Ray and Lou attempt to flee, and Tony is unable to shoot. Bobby returns, takes the gun from Tony, and shoots Lou, while Ray escapes on foot. Bobby tells Tony that Ray will have to reach the highway to get help, and that Tony may still be able to catch him. Tony tracks Ray down to the same shack where his wife and daughter were assaulted. Ray wakes to find Tony there and is surprised that he followed him. Ray begins taunting Tony, mocking his weakness and bringing up his wife and daughter. Tony points the gun at Ray, visibly shaking. Ray tells him he does not know how to use it. Tony shouts at him and cocks the gun. Ray secretly grabs a fireplace poker and lunges at Tony. Tony responds by shooting Ray twice. Ray realizes he is dying and, in his final moments, strikes Tony with the poker. As she reads this, Susan recalls sitting in the parking lot of a hospital with her future husband. Through their conversation, it is revealed that Susan has just had an abortion without telling Edward, the child's father. She expresses guilt, but the man reassures her that Edward will never find out. Moments later, Susan notices Edward standing in the parking lot, watching her from a distance. This reframes the novel Susan has been reading. Edward's sense of powerlessness and loss, losing both his wife and unborn child, mirrors Tony's loss in the manuscript. Edward transforms this experience into the novel, directly challenging Susan's belief that he lacked the strength or talent to become a serious writer. Back in the manuscript, Ray and Tony are both on the floor. Tony eventually regains consciousness, only to realize that Ray blinded him with the poker before dying. Tony stumbles outside, bleeding heavily from his eye. He collapses, and his gun discharges accidentally, killing him. In the present day, Susan receives a reply to her email from Edward agreeing to meet while he is in town. Susan arrives at an upscale restaurant, dressed carefully for the occasion. She is seated and waits for Edward. Time passes, but he never arrives. It becomes clear that Edward has stood her up. The end. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And until next time.